But we are joined by Greg Wrubell, voice of Brigham Young Athletics, with us. Craig Smoak, David Smoak, and 365 Sports. Greg, there will be July 1st here in just a matter of, a week and a half. What is the thought right now? As everyone knows, it's going to happen, Brigham Young. But what is the feeling as we get closer to that July the 1st, the official first day?
Yeah, the 10-day countdown is on, and BYU has a bevy of events planned in the week leading up to July 1st. A grand celebration, including a countdown celebration at 11:30 p.m. on the night of June 30th. So just outside the student-athlete building on the football practice fields, there will be an attendance-limited event from 11:30 to midnight. So when the clock strikes midnight and BYU officially becomes a member of the Big 12 Conference, it'll be kind of a Big 12 New Year of sorts as the celebration goes down, ending at midnight on that night. And then the next day, back on the practice fields, an afternoon-long celebration with all kinds of activities planned, and that just caps a week of events next week. And so a big build-up, a lot of preparation going into it, and a lot of cause for celebration.
Well, Gray, that's very cool to hear how much excitement there is being drummed up and generated, and just folks happy to be a part of the Big 12. I know that we probably discussed it before, and we have a lot of people who know about BYU and you know them over the years, but can you kind of explain maybe for folks who don't realize why this is such a big deal? Why is this such a big deal to be joining the Big 12 for BYU?
Well, I think for a number of years, guys, BYU and its fan base have kind of viewed the school and its athletic programs as P5 caliber, but without the P5 stamp, right? And whether it's attendance or facilities or the ESPN contract or national championships or national trophies like the Heisman, there are a lot of things BYU has done that says P5 caliber performance, P5 level visibility, P5 level respect from other schools and conferences, but you never really had that stamp of approval. You were out of the club, and there were some hindrances. Access was curtailed. If you're not a P5 member, there are some access issues. And yes, BYU had, you could argue, as good a chance of anybody else to find its way in, but the access wasn't as smooth as it is when you're, of course, a P5 member. And so it meant a lot. And yeah, there's a financial component to this. Fiscally, it's a big boost, but that was never really the overriding concern for BYU. When you decide to go independent, it's a gamble. And BYU did as well as it could do with that gamble. ESPN provided, a fiscal, not a lifeline, but truly a benefit of sorts to help BYU through that 12-year era of independence. And the Cougars did well for themselves. Again, this was not purely about finances, but clearly the finances are a part of the new equation and another sign of what P5 schools have come to expect when it comes to their ability to contribute funding to resources and still progress their programs at a level that keeps them competitive.
You know, I've always thought of them Power 5. I just have. Whatever the term might be, maybe it's from the days forever of them being a part of being independent, and I know they've been a part of other conferences. Do you feel like that they might be, as an athletic department, in the best shape among the incoming four immediately?
I would say yes, and I'll explain why. And first of all, your point is echoed by the fact that you'll recall, guys, in the last number of years, conferences began introducing their non-conference P5 quotas, right, for their football scheduling. And BYU got a rider into those, where those conferences and schools were saying, we'll count BYU as a P5 quota in that non-conference scheduling requirement. So BYU was already getting the respect of those leagues and programs by counting BYU as a school that goes toward that quota. So that's another example of where, BYU was viewed that way. We should also note that BYU is the only non-P5 team to win a national championship in football since World War II. Again, that kind of P5 visibility or P5 respect, even though it was back in 1984, it still counts. The P5 wasn't truly part of our vernacular back then, but the point is, if you go outside the P5 membership, BYU is the only one to do it since World War II. But now to your last part of your question, I think yes, because BYU's played an independent schedule for 12 years, which allowed the Cougars to play multiple P5s per year, more P5s than you would play as a traditional G5. And so BYU found itself playing 5, 6, and 7 P5 and opponents per year, every year as they ramped up independence. And so I think the on-ramp to the Big 12 is better for BYU than it might be for the other schools just for that reason, just for the fact they've played a steadier diet of P5 programs in the years leading up to the Big 12. Not to say that UCF or Houston or Cincy couldn't outperform BYU, but only that. BYU's diet of P5 teams has been steadier than it has been for the other G5 schools coming into the season.
Greg, when it comes to the football team and the changes this offseason, change in defensive coordinator, change in personnel, what does it feel like in terms of the to-do list? Did Kalani Sitake basically nail everything he needed to? Is there a couple of things that maybe remain more of a what, or we don't quite know yet? How would you sort of describe the attack of the offseason and what they were able to accomplish?
Well, bringing Jay Hill in is the headline of the offseason. Only one defensive coach was kept from the previous staff, and that's Bernard Guilford in the defensive secondary. Jay Hill leaves a head coach position, albeit FCS. He leaves a head coach position to become a coordinator with Kalani Sitake. Now, Kalani and Jay go back. They've had a long relationship. They were on the same staff at Utah together. And by the way, just if I could backtrack for a second, Kalani had that previous experience of going G5 to P5 with Utah. So he's done the ramp up once before, and he thinks that BYU's in a better spot than Utah was in terms of entering the P5 level for a lot of the reasons I just stated a minute ago. So Kalani's been through it before and knows what he's doing now. And I think having had that previous experience at Utah and going P5 to P5 helps Kalani and Jay in the build-up to this new entrance into the Big 12. But back to your point, Jay Hill comes in and what he has to do, and I think will do, is increase BYU's havoc rate. The Cougars just weren't making enough plays defensively. There were some things BYU did well when it comes to points allowed and the quote unquote cliche bend not break philosophy that worked to an extent, but I think more plays had to be made by the defense, not just manage but actually exert influence. And I think whether it's the pressure they didn't get up front or the plays that weren't made on the back end, BYU has to find a way to be a bit more disruptive team defensively, because on offense they took care of the ball very, very well. Under Aaron Roderick, BYU's been one of the best teams when it comes to turnovers lost. It's the turnovers gained BYU has to do a better job with, and then the overall disruption up front. And I think we've already seen with transfer portal additions and then the change in philosophy Jay Hill brings, the potential for BYU to be a much more disruptive and havoc-creating team on defense than they were last year.
Greg, the facilities. I know the stadium will, I believe, not next year, not this season, but after Texas and Oklahoma leave, it might be the largest stadium in the Big 12. There are others right there at the 60,000 mark, but most of them underneath of that. The facilities, the arena, the basketball arena is fantastic. Is that pretty much where they are with facilities pretty set, or will the influx of Big 12 money help do some other things they want to do?
Well, I'm sure there are some refurbishments BYU has in mind, especially at football. It's a great stadium. It's 63,000 plus. It will be the biggest stadium once Texas and OU leave the league, and the Marriott Center will conversely be a large venue as well. With BYU and Kansas drawing annually the best crowds, I think you'll see year to year in the Big 12 as the Marriott Center is around 18,000. So, venue-wise and size-wise, nothing BYU has to do to compete in the Big 12 because they're already there. I think what you are going to see again are ways to, kind of gussy up the venues and maybe increase the hospitality options and do that with some of the funds we could see pouring in the years to come. But from a pure venue availability and preparedness standpoint, BYU's right there. I think actually since BYU's accepted the bid, guys, you've seen a lot of images of whether it's LaVell Edwards Stadium or Miller Park, the baseball and softball complex, kind of find their ways onto social media, and people saying, wow, what a view they've got there at BYU with the mountains in the backdrop, and it's of course on full display for those football games. And then the Marriott Center itself, although it's an indoor venue, is as impressive a venue as they come in college basketball. And, perennially, they're a top 15, top 20 team in attendance and leading the West or second in the West every year in terms of college basketball attendance, topping Pac-12 teams in the area. So I think what BYU's done, and it has done with its venues, stands itself in good stead to compete and be right there with the best of the Big 12.
Greg, I know that they've had so many great teams that have come through there that, it's not like, oh, wow, they're playing this team for this big team for the first time ever. I mean, the BYU's used to playing some very good teams, but looking at that first Big 12 schedule, was there anything that necessarily jumped out to you or the fan base? I'd have to imagine getting that one crack at Oklahoma, even though I know they played before, but getting them in the final year when you might not play them again is probably going to be pretty cool to host that. But beyond that, like what kind of jumped out to you from the schedule, if anything?
Yeah, getting Oklahoma in Provo, not just getting them in Provo, but getting them in late November.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows what things will be like in the mountains in late November. And so if there's going to be any kind of environmental advantage, it might come to BYU in late November with the Sooners visiting on November 18th at altitude in wintertime or close to wintertime. That'll be interesting. Of course, when you go to Austin, that's always a circle the calendar date. And let's remind folks that BYU has played Oklahoma and Texas 7 times historically, and they're 6-1. So they've done okay against those marquee programs. And of course, the eras change. The Oklahoma games were, in the 90s and the aughts, and Texas more recently, but they have played them 7 times and lost only the 1 game. So the Texas and OU games are the natural highlights, and BYU's had success against Texas both in Austin and in Provo, and that'll be the final game of October for BYU. But then you back up into September, and you naturally have to look at the firsts, right? The first Big 12 game is BYU at KU in Lawrence on September 23rd, and then the first Big 12 home game is a Friday night at LaVell Edwards Stadium at 8:15 p.m. Mountain Time, 9:15 Central, 10:15 in the Eastern Time Zone. Those marquee primetime Friday night BYU games that they've played so many times over the last, decade plus of independence, and that'll be how BYU opens its Big 12 tenure at home. So those 2 are September highlights, followed by the natural highlights of Texas and OU in October and November. And the Oklahoma State series hasn't been contested for a long time for BYU. So getting into Stillwater for the first time is also a great way to end the regular season on November 25th.
I got to tell you, when you mentioned that there's a countdown on Friday of next week, the 30th, I think that's really cool. I've seen your Twitter handle. There's 11 days left, and then you mentioned something that had to do with 11, then now 10. And so it's fun. It's great to see 4 schools that can't wait to be a part of it. Houston had kind of an event last night as they start to count down. And, Greg, we appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you at Big 12 Media Days and also the start of the 2023 season.
Yeah, I'll be there. Looking forward to getting to Arlington for that. And, my Twitter will have a few more countdown stats coming up over the next 9 days as well. So thanks for mentioning that. I appreciate it. And, BYU and Cougar Nation's thrilled because the Big 12 isn't only a great move for BYU. As you can tell in the realignment wars right now, it's among the most stable moves the school can make right now. The Big 12, I think, is in great shape with a really bright future. And, guys, it is always a pleasure to come on with you.
You too, Greg. Greg Wrubell, voice of BYU Athletics, with us on 365 Sports. In the 4 o'clock hour, we'll start.